Please note that this episode covers real-life murders, serial killers, and the terrible acts that they committed. Some people may find what we're talking about in this episode disturbing.
Incoming transmission now.
Hey guys, welcome to Voided Transmissions. I'm your host, Jason Brazier, and I am very, very, very excited today to have John Borowski. Did I pronounce that right, John?
Yes, Borowski.
Awesome. A documentary filmmaker, I would say true crime historian as well. And just thank you for taking the time to talk.
Thank you for having me on. It's nice to finally, talk with you, over virtual. We've been friends on Facebook for a while, so it's my pleasure. I'm happy to talk and, let people know what I have to say about serial killers.
Awesome. Well, let's just kind of get started off with this. I mean, how did you really even just get into documentary filmmaking?
Well, documentary filmmaking, when I was in college, I went to Columbia College in Chicago for filmmaking, and I wanted to be, in the end, a well producer and filmmaker. So my intention originally was to film a direct narrative feature films, but I studied everything. I even studied, editing on, at that time it was the Avid computer editing, and I actually edited film, which it's very different when you're holding film, because I think, they do say some of, the new generation with digital, their editing might not be as sharp as, the older generation. And that's because, I knew the value of 2 frames, because when you're holding it and you physically cut it, the value of 2 frames. But, it was great experience. And I studied everything from sound design to acting, everything I could take. But, and then it was really, I was doing a history of Chicago report, and I read about castle of H.H. Holmes in Chicago during the World's Fair. And I thought that was interesting. Then I found another book about him by Harold Schechter, and that really filled his whole life. So he wasn't just a maniac. This guy had 3 wives. He had children. He built this building. He would do scams. He was like an evil genius, H.H. Holmes. So it's like, you know what? I'm going to be graduating college. This would be a great film to springboard me, into the industry. And of course, I didn't have, $100 million budget to do a narrative,
Yep.
feature film. I could still do it. I love it. I see it as a 3-part series, but we could talk about that another time. But so I'm like, okay, well, what could I do? I could do a documentary. And at that time, when I had graduated, I was working for the village of Bensonville, which is a suburb here in Illinois. It's a suburb of Chicago, right near O'Hare Airport. And I was doing a lot of video work, filming, TV work for them. And, I got even more into the documentary format. And I thought, well, I could do this H.H. Holmes film through interviews, stock footage, and reenactments, and really make it come to life, because no one had ever made a film on H.H. Holmes. And I thought, well, this is my opportunity. Yeah. And, that really started it. That, because my background, I always loved horror films. So, of course, learning about serial killers, that was, it's like reality horror in that sense. So I thought this could be good. And then H.H. Holmes won awards and was distributed, and it's still my top seller, even though it was shot on SD video, the first digital video camera that came out. Yeah. But it's still SD, and it's still the highest seller. And that goes to show you that the story is more important than anything. I always say, I'd rather see a well-shot film that's emotional, that's shot on VHS, than something $200 million that has no heart, So, and that's what really started me. And I'm like, okay, people like this serial killer stuff. And, that was in the mid 2000s.
Yeah.
And, the serial killer thing was still a little taboo, but that was a hit. So I figured, well, I'll just continue on with that.
Well, that's awesome, because my first introduction and hearing about you was I came across your documentary about H.H. Holmes. And I can't remember what streaming platform it was on. I just came across it, and I remember watching it, and I had never heard of him. And so I was just blown away, yes, by like what you said. This guy was an evil genius. Like, it was crazy that he had this horror hotel. And I think one of the craziest things, I mean, every part was crazy, but the one part that I found the most disturbing was the room that he would put people in, then turn gas on.
Oh yeah. I mean, this guy was truly evil. He killed men, women, and children. He had gas lines leading to rooms. So if anybody was visiting the World Fair, he would rent the rooms out to them,
Hmm.
gas them, kill them, go into the rooms, take their money and valuables, throw them down a grease chute into the basement or carry them down, and then sell their skeletons to medical schools. He was a total for-profit serial killer. It's absurd. I know.
Oh God,
It's absurd when you think about it, but these things really happen.
yeah. Well, it's almost it's comical because it's like,
Yes.
he's like, well, I could do this, but I might, hey, I can make money off of it, I guess. And it's just it's mind blowing that he was. I mean, and back in those times, it was easier to get away with that type of thing, I guess, too. But the fact that he built this entire hotel, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I remember correctly, because after I watched your film, I looked up stuff on him too. I was like, I had to know more about this guy. Didn't he like pay different groups? Like certain people only built parts of it, so nobody really built the whole thing as one like group.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, he would hire and fire different contractors. So no one really knew the layout of this building because once you get in it, especially the second floor, it was like a maze, a virtual
Hmm.
labyrinth. It had all these, you'd walk into one room and there's 5 doors. Okay, well, where does that door lead? Some doors would lead to a brick wall, and he wanted to disorient people if they ever got away with him.
That's just crazy. It almost reminds me of the Winchester Mansion in a way.
Yes, yeah, many people do mention that, and it's very similar to his. And I forget the dates when it was built, but who inspired who in that regard.
Yeah, no, man, that's true. Well, and there was that American Ripper series that came out, and well, you were interviewed on that, weren't you?
Yes, and that's it's interesting because I always have like a little, not a bone of contention, but when they contact me, and what it's about. It's
Mhm.
American Ripper and the great great grandson of H.H.
Holmes,
Holmes.
yeah.
Yes, he has a theory that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper. And I mean, everybody's got, to sell airtime. So, but
Yeah.
they wanted to interview me, and I said, okay, look, I'll be on it, but I'm not going to talk about Holmes being Jack the Ripper. I'll talk because he wasn't. I told him that exactly, and I said I'll talk about his building and him himself, his mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then I remember, I don't think that it's happened yet because I figured I would have heard about it. But didn't like, what isn't the basement of where Holmes's hotel? Well, does it still exist possibly? Because I remember I think it may have been that series that said they were going to try to go and try to dig and see if they could find it.
Yeah, I think they were going to try and do some sort of follow up to that show, which I haven't heard anything about.
I haven't
But
either. Yeah.
so the whole property where the Holmes's castle sat on, there's a post office on it, but the post office is a little further west than where Holmes's actual building was. So, the
Mhm.
basement of that post office only goes so far. So,
Yeah.
how much of that was under Holmes's castle? There's probably the most of it they can't get to, and again, it's interesting. That's, I think, people more into the paranormal are interested in that. I did go in the
Uh-huh.
post office and they said they did hear,
Yeah.
I love paranormal movies. Like I
Yeah.
loved Changeling and The
Yeah.
Exorcist, but for me, I seek the truth. That's what it's about
Mhm.
for me.
Yeah, well, that's what I think. Like, that's, for me, what I like about documentary filmmaking, because I haven't made anything like you yet, but I've made some short projects, and I've asked, I have the Flying Greek right now that I've done,
Yeah.
and for me, documentary filmmaking, I kind of tell people it's kind of before I became a filmmaker, I wanted to be an archaeologist. I was into preservation and history, but I
Mm-hmm.
also love storytelling, and I kind of fell in love with film and storytelling. And I started off in live theater, but to me, documentary for me is kind of a beautiful melding of my love for creative storytelling with film, but also preserving people's stories in a unique,
Well,
creative way. And that's what I like about it too, because I want to seek the truth. And it's also not about what I know, but what I want to know or what I'm going to find out.
Yes, yes. And you're right. It is like an archaeological dig when you're looking for this stuff. And the further back you go, it's either harder or impossible to find things. There are floods in basements, fires, people steal these mugshots and files and sell them on eBay, or collectors get a hold of them. So it's getting harder and harder to find these research items the further you go
Yeah.
back. I got lucky with some of my films, but even researching Gacy, and that was in, 78 was when when he was apprehended. But even now, they're still holding on to these, a lot of the items, or the big time stock photo companies get a hold of a handful and they charge you like $500 for one
Oh,
photo.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, because there's also the Holmes Peitzel case book, which I have a digital
Mhm.
copy of. But if I recall, didn't H.H. Holmes also write what happened to him in his own words, but it's kind of definitely embellished?
Yeah, he did. He called Holmes's own story, and that was written pre-trial. So, of course, he's so elaborate. I would never harm those children. I was like a father to them. It's like such bullshit, but it's that's him. That's a serial killer. That's what
Yeah.
they do. But I mean, I think there's some glimmers in it. You hear about the bullies dragging him into the doctor's office, and he was scared
Mhm.
of the skeleton. I think that happened, and that did create an interest in the human anatomy and skeletons.
Mhm.
Flash forward and you see what he was doing. But you're right, a lot of it was. And he says one point in the book, well, my father didn't spare the rod. Well, okay, what does that mean? He beat you?
Well, yeah, that's
No,
kind of yeah,
it's
that's
like,
kind
what
of
is it?
that's open ended. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and but then the Holmes Peitzel case, I think that was actually the case file that one of the cops, I believe.
Yes, Detective Frank Geyer, who was sent to find the missing children that were with Holmes, the Peitzel children, he went on the search for the children, and he wrote a book all about his journeys, which is very fascinating. I
Yeah.
released a book called The Strange Case of Dr. H.H. Holmes, and in my book is all three of those books complete. So you have the Holmes Peitzel case, you have Holmes's own story, another book called The Holmes Castle, all from 1895, 1896, and Holmes's Confession. So it's a great resource, a book.
That's awesome. Um, so and you've kind of answered this too about the serial killer thing, because I mean, let's be honest, what is it about true crime that draws people in? Because I know one of my favorite pastimes, my wife and I, for years, ever since we've been married, was we would just find an interesting true crime documentary on Netflix or Hulu, and we would just end up watching it because my wife's a school counselor, so she studies psychology, and so she's very intrigued by the psychology of a lot of these things. I mean, is there a inherent thing that true crime does to us that makes us want to watch that, and why it's so popular?
Yeah, I think it's really the fact that, we don't see these people every day. We don't turn around and see our neighbors, our husbands, our brothers, our sisters, killing people left and right. We don't see that. So we're fascinated by the fact, especially the serial killer, not only they kill, but they hunt. They're predators, and they do it over and
Mhm.
over again. So we're trying to figure out, wow, that's amazing, that, fascinating that they're compelled to do these things over and over again, like an addiction. So there's that. But I found there's many different levels. You may have, many housewives or other people who just sit at home and read a book or watch the documentary shows. Then you have collectors. Then
Yeah.
you even have people in the law enforcement industry. I know a former police officer who owns three Gacy paintings, has them in his living room, and his wife doesn't mind.
Huh, it's fascinating,
It
and
is.
it's yeah, and which brings me to my next question. The next film you did was on Albert Fish. Is that correct? I believe that.
Yes.
Yes. So how did you find out about Albert Fish? Because I remember watching that, and I was just like, my God, he is digging up some stuff I've never heard about. This guy is messed up.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to find somebody to, who could top H.H. Holmes. Well,
Well,
and
that was
Albert
pretty
Fish,
good.
right? He tops him in the gruesomeness. I think he's like, the most decrepit. To me, he's the scariest serial killer because he preyed on children. And he would
Mhm.
say that he didn't, he said he never raped the children, and I don't believe he did. He just wanted to hear them, their cries and screams. That's what he got off on. So he would torture them just to hear them muffled cries and screams. And he was just this, nasty, kind of old man, which is interesting because he started later in life in his 40s and 50s,
Mhm.
which usually serial killers start in their 20s. But yeah, Albert Fish was just this grandfatherly looking old man in New York
Yeah,
City in the 20s and 30s.
Well, and the way you shot a lot of the scenes, I remember there was a house that you shot that it was a decrepit, old looking house. I don't know where you found it.
Mhm.
And the way you shot it, I mean, it was just pure horror.
Yeah.
Like, you didn't have to show me him. I was just like, this house is making me freak out the way you were filming it. And it was just because, like, um, it was just the setup, and I can't remember which part of the
Yes,
film it was.
I think that was the part when he talks about his wife leaving him.
Yes.
So when his wife left him, she took everything. She took the children and she took everything, all furniture. I think he said she left him like a dime or a penny in the bathtub. Like she took everything.
Yeah.
So because, she found out obviously some of these things that he was doing, he wasn't killing at that point, but he was placing ads and he wanted to do S&M with, other women. And so what I did, it's interesting. I don't think I've ever told this story. So it's a first here.
Oh, all right.
So I lived in LA at the time period. I'm from Chicago, but I lived in LA for 4 years and I'm back in Chicago now. So when I lived there, I was filming all these reenactments for Albert Fish. And I knew I needed a vacant kind of like house or apartment. So a lot of times realtors leave these apartments open.
Mhm.
So there was literally apartment, I think it was 2 doors away from me, and they had a sign outside for rent. So one day I went, the door was open. I'm like, okay. So I called the actor. I said, hey, come on over now. We'll get you in a costume. We filmed it in 15 minutes. It's like real guerrilla filmmaking.
That's awesome.
No permission. Don't get permission, people.
Is that the ones where was that the actor that was playing Albert Fish?
Yes. His name was he's Otto Brezina, and he was at that time he was like in his 70s, and he was climbing up hills and doing all this stuff for me. He got naked. I asked, I'm like, could you get naked for this one scene? He was like, yeah, no problem. Just give me a robe. I'm like, that's what I want. That's the actor that you want.
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, he was amazing.
Well, yeah, and that I think I recall the scene too in that room you're talking about. I mean, there was a couple of shots you had where he was just like in front of a window.
Yes.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
God,
Very, very, very. Like you're saying, very ghostly. Like it was his silhouette standing there with his hat on. Yeah.
But by God, it worked. I mean, I can't get that image out of my head.
Yep.
Because of how it was done. So bravo.
Well, thank you.
And now there is one I have not seen yet, and it is on my list, and so I'm going to ask you to forgive me on that. But I want to see it because it has one of my favorite voice actors in it.
Yes, John DiMaggio.
Yes, because I love Bender.
Yes,
Bender's I love it. I have a little figurine at home, and it still works, and it says all of Bender's lines.
Oh yeah, he is great, and yeah, the film is Carl Panzram, and you definitely have to see it. It's highly
it's on my list. I will.
Yeah. So yeah, and I knew I had to find this voice because Carl Panzram was this lifetime criminal in the early United States. His home was jails and prisons. He was a really tough guy. Supposedly he killed, 20 something people. He said, I went to Africa and shot the Africans and fed them to crocodiles, all this crazy, insane stuff. And he was very strong, but, I knew I needed a voice for him that, depicted who he was as a character. So at one time I remember I was watching Gears of War, or playing the Gears of War video game. I play games and I heard him on there and I'm like, this is the guy. And of course, right. Phoenix was his name or whatever. And, but then, I looked up a while. I was like, wow, he's a Futurama, because I didn't know he has done so much, John DiMaggio.
Oh yeah. You wouldn't know. He's so good at it.
Yeah. Well, if you ever, I'll have to remind me, I'll send you a DVD of Panzram movie, because there's outtakes with John DiMaggio. He did all these voices and awesome. It was like, oh my God, it was hilarious. At one point he was, he would do the narration, I killed all these people. And then he would take a break. He's like, this guy needs a hug and a sandwich. So it was fun, it was a blast,
That's awesome.
Fun. Yeah, it was a good time recording.
That's great, man. I got close to getting his autograph one time, but it was pre-COVID. And I was at some convention, and I went to stand in his line, and they were like, well, no, this isn't the line. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is usually when nobody's in front of the tables, you would just go stand on the line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Behind the tape. And they're like, oh, no, you start over there. And there was this like line against the wall. Mm-hmm. And then they would come and get you and bring you over to them 3 at a time. And I was like, well, I was like, oh, God, I've come this far. I might as well try. And I sit there for probably 2.5 hours, and I didn't move probably 3 inches in this line.
Wow.
And my wife came by and said, I want to meet him, but I can't stand here anymore.
Yeah,
And
it's tough. I do a lot of those conventions, and there are lines, especially like one of the recent ones, Robert Englund, of course, Freddie. So yeah, it was
mhm.
insane.
Oh yeah. Well, and then I did see this one, and I watched it, and it was it started out as a film and then became a series. That was you have a that I saw on Amazon, and that was Serial Killer Culture TV.
Yes, so the film originally was Serial Killer Culture,
Yes.
and that did really well because as I was making my films on serial killers, of course, I met so many people from forensic psychologists to detectives and writers, authors, people who are involved, family members of these killers, collectors, people who collect this stuff. And I'm like, and after meeting all these people, I thought, well, this is a serial killer culture. And I created that term, serial killer culture. And I'm like, this is because it encompasses so many things of everyone from law enforcement, whoever is, in doing something with serial killers. But I find it interesting, and that's what I tried to focus on that film, creators. So not only collectors, but people who create art, such as Hart Fisher with the Dahmer comic, or Sparzanza, which is a Swedish band that did a song on Albert Fish and used some of my audio. Again, these artists that Joe Coleman, who does paintings on serial killers, why they're fascinated as artists, to create these works of art on killers. And then it was so well received that I did a TV show, and there's 2 seasons, and that's Serial Killer Culture TV.
Yeah, and I highly recommend that for anybody who hasn't seen that too, because each episode is very focused and very, very unique. Because I remember you did an episode where you about the Gacy paintings that people had.
Yes.
And so I guess my next question I would have to ask is, what is it after doing all these films so far, especially after the series? What is it that you found that people? How do people get? Because to me, I like learning these things. I find this serial kill, like true crime documentary, is very fascinating. From not only just an interest of like the psychology of it, but as a filmmaker as well. But for me, I would never be like. For me, I'm like, I don't want to really own anything that the Manson family had. To me, I'm like, what is it that draws some people to want to collect those things or seek those things out, do you think?
I think it's that whole counterculture thing. You're doing something that, is banned on eBay and society says is taboo. Anything that's taboo, people are going to be fascinated by. But you're right. It's only a select amount of people that collect these things or desire them. Now, some, it's only business for them. William Harder, he's in one of my shows, and that's his business. He buys, collects, and sells and trades all of this, serial killer stuff, whether it's, a fingerprint chart or a painting by a killer or a killer's ashes, or, it could be anything, a door handle from, where, the Bianca murders were, or Manson, all these things, underwear, fingernails, people trade. Yeah, it's strange, but people,
so strange, yeah.
I think it's, people, not only them, but the people that buy the artifacts, I think they're, they just want to have a piece of this, dark history.
Well, yeah, and but I also find it fascinating because some of the people you talk to, they seem completely sane. It's just something that interests them. But then you hear the stories about like the woman who wanted to marry Charles Manson while he was, and then she was just going to keep his dead body when he died. And it's just like, yeah, I don't,
I know.
Where's the line here?
Well, here's the thing too, I mean, now of course there's TikTok and, smartphones and photos could take very easily. But even, going back, 10, 20, 30 years, there wasn't. So how did someone, be close enough to someone who's infamous? Well, a woman would want to marry them. And guess what? Well, now the sensationalism of the press is talking to her, and now she's a celebrity as well now because she's marrying the serial killer. So I think there's some of that too that people that attention. I
Like that
enjoy that.
their 15 minutes of fame.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
But I mean, you're right though. I mean, when I talk to many of these collectors, and what they say is true, it's just like collecting baseball cards. For some people, it's just that they're collecting these things, and they are, again, they're all kinds of things. It is dark history, but they're not killing anybody. They're just collecting this stuff, and they have families, they have normal lives. It's more of a hobby for many of the collectors, and for them to meet other people. And like I said earlier, it's great that my experiences creating these serial killer documentaries have introduced me to so many people and traveled to so many places. And to me, it's the journey, of course, that is, the great process of making these films. Because yes, you have a film, but for me personally, it's, I could say I've done all these things. I've been to, Clinton Prison and Dannemora where Panzram was, and, not just the locations, but these people and experts that I've met. I mean, when I met the two detectives who arrested Gacy and the orthodontist who identified the majority of the dead, boys, but I would tell them, each of them, you are a hero. You know what they'd say? They were so down to earth. They would say, we were just doing our jobs. But it's like, yeah, but you did these great things, and I look at them as heroes because they stopped, him from doing more, and they identified, these poor boys.
Sometimes you see documentaries out there that you're like, man, that's just a crazy story. And you see that a lot in true crime. But you took a break from true crime and did a movie on an artist named Vincent Castiglia.
Yes.
How did that film come to fruition?
Well, the film is called Bloodlines, the art and life of Vincent Castiglia. And of course, and I'm sure a lot of people notice that I do love art as well, being a filmmaker, but just art in general as well, paintings and sculptures. I actually wanted to go into special makeup effects when I was a teenager, so I sculpted and did a lot of that stuff. And Vincent and I were friends on social media for a while because we both appreciated each other's works. And Vincent does these paintings either in his own blood or collector's blood if somebody wants to hire him. Like Margaret Cho did a portrait. He did a portrait of Margaret Cho in her blood. He did the Slayer guitarist Gary Holt. He did the guitar in Gary Holt's blood, and that's in the film. It shows the whole process of how Vincent extracts the blood, and usually he has a nurse or a phlebotomist there that does it. And it's very fascinating to see how he works, and the process is amazing. So he had posted, I believe on Facebook one time, a question asking his fans saying, people are saying I should do a reality show. What do you think? And I don't know if he was approached by it, but a lot of people were like, yeah, that's awesome. Cool. But I sent him a long message or even responded to that post. And I said, I think, Vincent, that would do a disservice to your art because I do know what reality shows are like. They're scripted. Their producers basically tell people what to do. It's not reality. It's fake reality. And I told him that. I said, they could make you look like a fool. They want to start arguments with people. And I said, it might be detrimental to your career. I said, what you really need is a documentary film encompassing your entire life so people could see what brought you to this point, not just, little sound bites here and there. And then he messaged me privately and he said, do you want to do this? And I said, yeah. I said, I want to do it, but I want to paint my own blood. So that was the deal. And that's how that came about, and together we both worked on a Kickstarter, and pulled all our fans together, and we, I produced the movie with the Kickstarter funds, and it was great. Took us to Switzerland, to H.R. Giger's home and studio and his museum out there. Yeah, it was phenomenal, and met so many people. I think I have Greg Allman's last interview. I'm not sure, but I think we have that in there. Many musicians and Margaret Cho and so many great people. So that's how that came about.
That's amazing. Sometimes I always find it fascinating that I can be sitting there trying to search for a story or something to like spark my creativity. And sometimes it's the thing that I'm looking over here to my left, and it's like right here going, "Hi, I'm right here. This is me. This is the story. It's interesting." And I
Hmm.
don't see it until it hits me in the face sometimes. And sometimes I don't want to call it divine intervention or anything, but it just happens to
Yep.
happen. You saw a post and you commented or sent a
Hmm.
message, and it just blossomed into this film. And he did paint the picture of you because I think I saw it on your social media.
Yes, yeah, he did. And I told him I wanted something, decaying, dead, zombie-ish, so he did like a bust of me, but it's like a classical, like a bust in stone or whatever, but it's like
Yeah,
chipping. One of my eyes is white like a
yeah,
zombie, and
I
yeah,
saw
it's
that.
really
Yeah,
cool. So
that's
it's just
cool.
like
And so, is that in your blood?
that's in my blood. So in the
That's
documentary, it
cool.
shows he took 12 vials of my blood. And, beforehand, of course, I was on my way to, when I was staying in New York, I was on my way to his place. And I'm thinking, I probably should,
Yeah.
drink something or eat something because he's probably going to take a lot of blood. And right there in his refrigerator, he put my blood next to Greg Allman and Margaret Cho's. And I'm like, okay, I'm in good company, so
That's
yeah, it's
that's cool, man.
fascinating. Yeah.
And
And
does he do tattoos as well? Did I see
he
or read
does,
it?
yeah.
Yeah.
That's his main, I believe, his main source of income or his day gig. He does tattoos. Now he has a tattoo studio and an art gallery in Florida. So he
Wow. Okay.
relocated there. But when he was in New York, I stayed with him whenever we filmed. So, I mean, to me, what more of an honor can you have? Just imagine Salvador Dali, or to me it's the same thing because of course 100 years from now, that's when Vincent's going to be extremely popular. You know how that goes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But just being there with him and experiencing work, just standing there and literally watching him work for hours is just amazing. And how he worked with the blood, it was fascinating. So that I wanted to make that a main part of the documentary as well, to show how the process is working with blood,
Mhm.
because it's not easy.
Oh, I don't doubt that because I mean it's not regular paint.
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
Did he ever? Do you know? Did he actually have to like add something to it to kind of make it more paint like, or did he just dip
He
it?
he he does different levels. So what he does is it's just blood. He doesn't, if anything, he dilutes it with water, just
Really?
tap
Hmm.
water. And so that's how you would get the lighter
Fascinating.
shades. Yeah, and the darker shades would be pure blood.
And so, what was it like taking a break from true crime and doing a story like that for you?
It was nice. I like those breaks and I need them. Believe me, I'm going to need one after this Gacy
We're
documentary.
gonna get to Gacy in a
Yeah,
second.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was very nice because again, being with an art, his process and appreciating that, and then meeting all these other people who, I've known or who are idols of mine. I mean, being in H.R. Giger studio, that's another one of my dreams come
That's
true. It's
awesome.
like to see where he worked, where he died. I mean, all
And
that was
and
right there. I pet his cat.
so, did you screen the movie there, or were you like, was he doing like a show and you were filming it as part of the documentary?
We were filming it because Vincent, at one of his first art gallery showings, was at H.R. Giger's museum, because Giger kind of took, a shine to Vincent, and, he was like a little prodigy of his. So, obviously we filmed after Giger had passed, but
Yeah,
we did want to incorporate, their relationship together and how that worked.
absolutely.
Plus, of course, you've got the allure of Alien and, just all these
Yeah,
films Giger had worked on. But it was very interesting to see how Giger would sit. He would, paint airbrush on these huge panels that were like 4 or 6 feet by like 8 or 10 feet. And he would sit just in a little stool, a rolling stool that he would sit on. And he had a button that he would push, and he had a hole cut in the floor. So the whole canvas, the piece of wood, would just move itself, and he wouldn't have to move from his chair, just sit there, and he could move that canvas up or down by pressing a button. It was just amazing.
that's cool. Wow. So, from the film on Vincent, your next film was on John Wayne Gacy, and you're still working on that. And I know you and I have talked privately about that because I know that a lot of filmmakers, including myself, post, I don't want to say post pandemic, but post, COVID, if you will, when the world shut down, filmmaking has not been very easy for independent filmmakers. I mean, it's hit everybody differently, but and it was one of the reasons that my 45-minute documentary took 3 years to film because, or to finish at least, because we were getting ready to edit and then the world shut down. And I know that you've been dealing with a lot of ups and downs with it. And I know that, like I said, you and I have talked about that. But what is it what made you want to do a documentary on Gacy? Let's start there.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll talk about the pandemic stuff too, because obviously
Yeah,
that played a
absolutely.
role.
Yeah.
Because it's been 4 years this
Yeah.
summer that I've been working on it, but
Mhm.
my goal is to wrap it up this year. But so after Vincent's documentary, I believe I finished season 2 of Serial Killer Culture TV. I
Yes.
was
Yeah.
working on that, and then of course I wanted a new, biography on a serial killer. So I was trying to think, and I'm apprehensive to do more modern killers because people have heard of them, Ramirez's and things.
Yeah.
But when I go to a lot of conventions and expos, and I of course listen to feedback from people. And every time they would come to my booth, do you have anything on Dahmer? Do you have anything on Bundy? Do you have anything on
Mm,
Ramirez? Do you have anything on Gacy? So I listened to them, and at first I released while I'm working on the Gacy documentary, I had many files. So I released a book called Hunting a Predator, and it's all these case files about John Wayne Gacy and how he was apprehended. So, that was good. But I'm thinking, I tried to look at, okay, I had researched so much about Gacy, I thought it was almost meant to be. Gacy and I went to the same high school, Prosser
oh,
Vocational High
wow.
School.
Okay.
We both lived and grew up on the northwest side of Chicago. His father buried at the same cemetery where mine is buried, Mary Hill. We're both Polish. So there were all these similarities, and it's not just that. I thought, I could bring this about, in a fascinating way, and it's Chicago, where I'm from, so it's kind of like my hometown story.
Hmm.
And the great thing about it, I started it in 2019, just before the pandemic.
Yep.
But when I had started it, the great thing is almost everybody from that case is still here in Chicago. So I didn't have to pay exorbitant travel fees, hotels. They were here.
Yeah.
So, I have 21 people. I've interviewed more than 21, about 24, 25, but at least 21 of them met Gacy, arrested him, prosecuted him, talked to him, worked with him, sold his artwork. So it's a very, great source material. So I figured, let me do that. And I talked to a friend of mine, and, we started to go in on it together because we both had the same kind of cameras. So we would do interviews with 2 camera shoots, and of course it's here in Chicago. So B-roll, I just go out and do it. I just
Yeah.
film it. So
Yeah. Well, and what was it though about Gacy's story? Because I know we've talked a little because there's been so many documentaries
right.
that have been done about him, and I know as a filmmaker, if I'm going to do a story on somebody, it's like, well, what am I going to do that's going to make it stand out and be different than what other people have done before? So,
Exactly.
what was your approach?
I had researched, Gacy's entire life, and I thought, almost like H. Holmes, again, his Gacy's entire life is fascinating. Everything that happened to him, not just the case and the arrest and murders, you know, everything is fascinating. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do a film like I've done with the others, but there was just so much. It's turned into a miniseries. So now I don't know if it's going to be 4 or 6 part. I'm still working on that.
Mm-hmm,
But,
mm-hmm.
again, just the things he did, his childhood, how he grew up, and obviously he was abused by his father. We know that. And there were other things that happened to him as a child. And then going to Waterloo, where in Waterloo, Iowa, that's where his career of crime began. And not many
Mm-hmm.
people know that. When I tell them these stories, they say, I never knew that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in Waterloo, he had, he would chain up a teenage kid to his bed while he had sex with his wife at that time. I mean, there were weird things going on, and one of these kids that he had abused had wound up, ratting on him. And that's how he went to prison. And he was supposed to go for 10 years. But because he was such a nice guy and helpful, he only served like 12 months, or like, I think it was 8 months or 13 months. But again, when you see his time in Waterloo, you see, a predator in the making, mainly a con man at first, because
Yeah.
he was a predator. That's how he got into Waterloo. In Anamosa Penitentiary. But you really see the con man aspect. He arranged to bring a closing miniature golf course from another part of the state all the way to the prison so that the inmates had something to do in the yard. Well, he did it. He successfully did it. And to this day, I went to Anamosa prison. That golf course is still in their yard.
Really? That's
Oh yeah. Oh, Gacy did
that's
great things.
crazy.
Oh yeah. Oh well, that's the thing. They thought this guy's great. He would help with the Christmas toy drive. He was on the choir, the Christmas and religious choir. He would sing. He was their chef. Everyone loved him. Everyone loved him in prison.
Which is kind of like the perfect, you know.
Predator, right? That's what
Yeah,
they do. It's the duality of serial killers. No one would expect them. And believe me, as we go on in the Gacy story, we see like how no one would suspect this guy. I
yeah.
mean, there would be times where he would kid around with people and say, "Oh, yeah, I got 2 bodies in the trunk of my car." And you know what they'd say? Yeah, whatever. Because he'd always
Because
kid about death
he
and
would
stuff like
joke,
that.
but
Yeah.
wow. So it's almost like, do you think it was more of a cathartic release that he was
Yes. Yes,
just
it was.
yeah,
Yeah. And that's the thing with serial killers, right? It's domination and control. So he knew inside, he was laughing inside, knowing that, they really don't know what I got under my house,
yeah,
But, seeing that progression from, kind of like, a rapist of, teenage boys turning out to be this con man and then coming back to Chicago and really getting his footing here and getting in with the right people, to where he was, became, part of the politics and bought the
yeah,
house in Norwood Park. And he ingratiated himself with society. So he was out in the open. And that was what was fascinating to me, how everyone in his neighborhood loved him. Everyone, he would walk into bars, even the detectives, they say, he'd walk in a bar, we'd go behind him. Everyone loved him. Hey, John, they'd pat him on the back, hug him. He'd tell jokes.
yeah.
He would send over beers to the detectives. Everyone loved this guy, but
Oh
that was his
wow,
cover.
man,
Yeah, that was his
that's
cover.
that's almost like the perfect backhand when you in retrospect.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
the chilliest thing is that when the detectives told me that, there was a time when they were with him and one of the detectives went to the bathroom and then Dave Hackmeister was at the table with Gacy, and Gacy said, it's great being a clown. You could put your arm around a woman and crop a feel. He's like, it's great. Dave, clowns could get away with murder. He knew that he did, and he said that knowing that he did, you know.
wow.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating everywhere you look at this case. And then, of course, many people know about the murders and the investigation, the trial, but not many people know that pre the time he went into prison, that was chapter 1. When he goes into prison, that's chapter 2. He was on death row for 14 years. He had a 900 number making money off of that. He sold paintings that he
What?
made money off of. He would write people. He said he wrote 27,000 people. So he had this great communication with people. Everyone wanted to interview him, Oprah, Truman Capote. And then, again, his time in prison was amazing. He even changed prison policy for the better.
Okay, for
So
the better. Okay.
yeah, and you find this, and with Carl Panzeram, he was in many prisons, and he had done that too, because Panzeram was hosed down at one of the prison, and the word got out to the governor, and the governor got rid of the warden and brought in someone who wasn't going to abuse these prisoners. So Panzeram kind of, sometimes these serial killers do something good in a sense. It's very strange, but like for the other prison population. So
Okay.
Gacy wrote the warden. He said, you're charging death row inmates more for photocopies than the general population. He said everyone in the
Wow.
prison should pay the same price. And they said, we're right. And they changed prison policy so everyone paid the same price for photocopies.
That's okay. Wow.
So,
I don't have any words. I'm like, that's
right.
just so
Yes.
crazy.
Right. And when you watch the whole Menard prison segment, your head is going to be spinning because it's like, that's the absurdity of this, right? How is this guy who killed all these kids here? Now he was really the first serial killer celebrity. Some of the other ones, of course, had fame and infamy, but this was the guy who, really created the serial killer celebrity because he had a business from his little jail cell, numerous businesses.
Well, and how did he? I mean, because how does somebody like that run a business from their jail cell?
Well, you'll have to see the documentary, but
That's
he
fair.
had,
That's fair.
but no, but he had people that would help him. Obviously, there were people
Wow.
on the
Yeah.
outside, and there were ways where you could get around the law. But there were times, of course, when the warden would crack down and say you can't do this, and then Gacy would contact the ACLU, and then the warden would say, okay, you
Wow.
could keep doing it because he got permit. The ACLU, first right, isn't it, the First Amendment rights, all these free
Yeah.
speech, so it's very interesting when you watch my documentary, people's mouths are going to be open to be
Oh,
like,
my
what?
mouth, my jaw's on the floor right
Yes.
now. I'm
Yeah,
like, what?
it is insane. It's insane. I mean, he threatened the warden because someone supposedly stole his paintings that he was going to ship out. I mean, this guy was he wrote his own book. He published 2 books with his letters in them. Yeah. He did all this from a
Well, but
jail cell.
where is this money gonna go though?
Okay. Well, you have to see the documentary again too, but
Okay, sorry, I'm getting too deep. I don't want to blow the
and
ruin it.
right in the
True.
end, Gacy, no matter how much money Gacy had, he could only buy stuff from the commissary,
Yeah.
or if other people
Yeah.
may have bought him or sent him something. So all he could do is buy, I think he liked Pepsi, and chocolate bars and that stuff, but that was
Wow.
about it. So, his money did go to different places. And, again, that's revealed in the documentary,
Yeah,
but it's
we
fascinating.
yeah, I definitely don't want to spoil anything. That's true.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
yeah, you've already just what you've told me just blown me away. I'm like, what?
Yeah, right. And so it was my intention, and when I was producing my film, of course, I reached out to many people, like I'd say 95 to 98% of the interviewees that I reached out to, the experts, agreed to be on my show. Some didn't, and they have their own reasons, and that's
Yeah.
okay. But
Mhm.
it's just to me, and the case is still open. So there are still, I think, about 4 unidentified victims that they're still trying to
Wow.
identify. Yeah, and so the Cook County Sheriff's Department opened the case again, and Lieutenant Moran, he's on the case, and I've interviewed him, and he even talks that something good could come from a serial killer because they identified other bodies that weren't Gacy victims to let these family know, okay, we found your brother who is dead. And that was kind of a good thing because they identified the body that, the family never could find. And very interesting.
Wow.
Again, I wanted to just to be interesting and fascinating to people. And I'm not just going for just the emotions and the sad stuff. I mean, people are going to be laughing a lot in this. It's crazy,
Yeah.
but that's how absurd it is. I crack up at some of the stuff. It's dark, but then you're like, what? These things actually happened? And yeah, it's really insane.
Well, I can't wait to see it because it just fascinates it fascinates the hell out of me. I mean, everything you're saying is just like this is just crazy.
Yes.
And and I know we've talked about it, and we can talk about the pandemic really quick because I know it's affected everybody in very unique ways. And with this film, I know it affected it affected the production as well. Do you mind talking about that?
Yeah, we started in summer of 2019, and we had filmed a lot of people. We really made progress because, like I said, I knew people were here. Walter Jacobson, who was a news reporter and interviewed Gacy, and Gacy's last attorney, Karen Conti, the prosecutor, the detectives. They're either in the city or the suburbs. So we really rocked and rolled and got a lot of people filmed. But then, of course, COVID hit. And it did shut me down for a little, but I think even that year, I think it was in the fall that I resumed because, things were obviously strange, but we did resume in the fall with masks and
Yeah.
safety. But, again, it was like, okay, I had 1 or 2 crew members and the interviewee, and we would, it wasn't like it was, really dangerous and, tight and close places. So then it started up again. And, it was still a little difficult after that. But the good thing is almost by the point after the pandemic began, I had interviewed, the majority of people, so there weren't too many left. But yeah, I mean, and then after that, it was really just me going out and filming B-roll in these locations. So, and again, I didn't have to worry about COVID for that. So yeah, it was a little bit of a pause on it. But during that pause, I was editing footage I had, researching, this case is just, I mean, you would really appreciate what I've done for this, film because
I already do.
for
what you told me.
I mean, the files and the people I've talked to and the things that have come to me by talking to these experts, because they have a lot of these materials and files and photocopies of things that are just amazing. So I'm using a lot of primary source documents in the film, so you can see, yeah, this is what they were talking about. These things happened. So because of course, again, I still don't have a huge budget, so I'm trying to think, well, I can't afford the stock footage or photos, but I have some of these photos and I have a ton of documents. So to back up what they're talking on screen, I'll show a document, of course, or the
Yeah.
location or
Uh-huh.
things like that.
Yeah.
Being creative.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like you're the almost like the Ken Burns of true crime, with
That's
the
what I've been told. That's what I've been told. And it is hard, I think, and you might attest to this. I've made short films that
Mhm,
are narrative films,
mhm, mhm.
but I think it's harder to make a documentary because when you're doing a narrative film, you've got to have the budget and this 1 month or whatever or two, we've
Yeah,
got to make this movie. And then
yeah.
you're done filming and then you start editing. But a documentary, along the whole 4 years, they're still filming, there's still research, there's still
Oh yeah,
editing,
it's I always equated doing a documentary to making a film backwards.
Yes.
And because you're like I always like yeah, I worked on a series called My Ozarks that a nonprofit called um it was in Donovan, Missouri that um they were doing tourism videos. But they didn't want to make them tourism videos. They wanted to do them as documentaries to get to know the people. And so
Hmm.
I directed 4 episodes of this. And the thing that I found that worked for me, I was like, we would interview the people beforehand so I could get the story idea.
Right.
And then I would kind of break it down to like a 3 act structure because these episodes were less than 10 minutes. And so I needed to accomplish a lot in a short time. And I would kind of I would create it and I would tell them, I'm like, this is the direction that we're going to go. But this is documentary. If these people say something
Hmm.
and we go off on a tangent and down left field of something that they didn't say before, we're going to follow it and we're going to
Yep.
make it work, but at least we have some type of direction. But that's the beauty of documentary. It's like we said, it's like archaeology. It's you dig up a lot of shit.
Yeah.
and, and
It's very
sometimes
true.
and sometimes that shit is well, I don't know if it's the best term, but that shit can be gold.
Yeah, that's true because again, me being, an insider, it's like the Lieutenant Jason Moran, who's on the case now, the Gacy case, and it made a lot of sense to me. He said there's a difference between the sensationalism that the press releases and the truth that the detectives know. There's a
Yeah,
big
yeah.
difference, and I always go to, the truth, obviously. And that's how it is with a lot of this stuff. There is a sensationalism like American
Mhm.
Ripper, or, you have, the truth, which are like mine. And like you're saying, okay, you have, let's say you have an entire film or a mini series. You're right. There's a beginning, middle, and end. But within each of these sections and
Yep.
subsections, there's a beginning, middle, and an end. You know what I'm saying? So it's
Yeah.
like it's crazy.
Yeah, and you never know. Like your first episode could end slightly different than you planned, but that's
Yes.
okay. But that's
Yeah.
okay. But as a filmmaker, you kind of have to have some generalized direction with a documentary because
Correct.
there's different ways of documentary filmmaking, and
Hmm.
like there's the fly on the wall. Like there's no script. You're just going and you're filming, and then you're gonna go edit it, and then you're gonna
Yep.
go back and film more. And that's a valid way of doing it. I can't do that. Like it's very difficult for me with ADHD to do that. and
Yeah.
and so like I like story any filmmaker who's done that type of documentary, I applaud you. You have all my respect. I just personally can't do it from my point of view. Like I have to take what I call the journalistic like I take a journalistic approach
Yes.
where
Me too.
I try to break the story down so I'm staying on story. But
Yes.
this is just a direction I'm going to go. It's just kind of
Correct.
a generalized map because
Right.
I know that something else could come up and I may end it differently, but at least I have a general direction of where I'm going to go. And it sounds like that's what you did. And maybe even the pandemic helped you with all these in-depth studies
Yeah.
that you had to do because there's stuff that you're telling me. I'm like, I've seen some Gacy documentaries. I've never heard this stuff. So this is going to be a really good one. I can't wait for you to when you finish it. I think it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, thank you. And that's the thing, I'm telling this story chronologically. And I've seen a lot of these Gacy documentaries and others back and forth, back and forth. You're like, okay, wait, are we in 78 or 92
Yeah,
here? Where are we at?
I
So
love I
mine,
love your titles by the way you've been doing that you've been
yes.
posting. I love them. I love them.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the thing. I'm going, pretty much year by year through his life. So what I do is I put the title of the year and I move it on the screen. So, but in back of the title, you could see through it, and it's like a little hint of what's coming up.
It looks awesome. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah. And,
Yeah, it's great.
and you're right. I take that journalistic aspect too, but you have to be prepared. That's my thing. ABP,
Yep.
you'll always be prepared, because let's say you're writing questions, to them about this aspect, but oh no, I forgot about this. And it's like, I cover everything. It's usually at least an hour or 2 hour interview with each person, because like you said, I just ask a question. I let them go. I'm not going to interrupt them or stop them. If they go on tangents, better for me, because I could edit all that stuff later.
Yeah.
So that's the route that I go to as well. And because I'd rather have more than, that's why when those DSLR cameras came out, I could never use those because they had a maximum capacity of like 10 minutes. And I'm like, shit, no, I need this to roll for an hour with no edits. I just let it roll.
Yeah.
And I just put the camera there. And a lot of these interviews I do myself too. I put the camera next to me. I have a little monitor. I rig up the wireless mic and the XLR mic, and I'm ready to go. I light it myself. And, sometimes obviously I will have helpers, but, it's a lot of run and gun guerrilla filmmaking. But you're right. That's what I do. It's that journalistic aspect, and definitely research everything about them in the case so you know where they fit in. Because they could fit in at an earlier part, but also with mine, what I'm trying to do is, with each section of my film, I'm trying to keep those people involved with that sequence or time period just in that part. So, you don't meet the detectives until they get involved when, Gacy's, when the last victim disappears. You don't see them earlier in the movie, and you don't see the people from early in the movie later, unless it's a wrap up.
It's like you're almost doing like what they did in the first season of True Detective, but you're doing it documentary style, but from the serial killer's point of view.
Exactly. Yes, it's all about Gacy. But here's the thing, and that's what I think also makes mine unique. It's not just all about Gacy, but it's all about these people and how they knew Gacy and how they lived and how how they became to be a reporter in Chicago. So it's a little bit about them. They're not just sitting there and say, oh yeah, he did this and he did that. They start by saying, well, here's how we got involved. Like Kieran Conti, his last attorney, they got involved because the state was suing Gacy because they wanted him to pay room and board, because they're like, wait, you're selling all these paintings. So that's when Kieran Conti came on board with her partner to help him with that. But then it turned into them working on the death penalty for him, because right at that time, that's when, they set the death penalty date. Very fascinating stuff.
Very fascinating. Yeah.
And, another one of my goals is for this to be, obviously, it's always educational, right? But this one, I especially want to be educational for people in numerous fields, whether it's forensic psychology, detective work, if you're going into legal matters, the trial, prison time. You learn all about these different aspects and what the Gacy, they went to Rockford to get the jury for Gacy because they've learned from previous serial killer cases that if you didn't do that, you could have a retrial. And with Gacy, everything went 100% perfectly. And that's the thing I want to also illustrate is that, okay, now we're talking about the court case and the legalities of it. And, how, the death penalty in Illinois began again at a certain time. So during the case, they only tried him for so many of the victims because they were murdered after the time when the death penalty was reinstated. All this is fascinating to me.
Well, it is fascinating. And when do you think since it's going to be more serial, like a miniseries, do you think it'll be released on Amazon, or do you have any plans, ideas yet for that?
I'm still talking to distributors, but definitely it'll be on Amazon, Apple TV. Like my films all now are streaming Amazon, Apple TV, Roku,
Tubi as well.
Yep. Tubi is great. Tubi is awesome. I tell people go to Tubi because you could see it for free and it really helps me out financially. So definitely watch it on Tubi. So yeah, that's where it'll most likely be. And like I said, I'm thinking 4 to 6 part miniseries. And right now, I think my timeline is anywhere from 5 to 7 hours. So, I'm doing this rough cut. So it's almost at that phase where it's like, okay, now I'm going to watch it all and say, okay, here are the final things I need to film, the finalities and clean it up. So.
Well, John, I am a fan. All the respect to you and what you do. I admire you and your work and what you do. And you're just a really awesome and creative filmmaker.
Thank you.
I just thank you for taking the time to share about your films and your work. I could talk to you for hours about this.
Yeah, we'll do it again. We'll do it
Yeah.
again. We could do shows just based on one of these movies because
That's
there's
true.
that whole
We
the
could.
history of how I made it and all those things. So I'd be up for that too. And
That's great.
send me your address and I'll get you a Panzram DVD.
Oh, thank you. That'd be
check it
awesome,
out.
man. Well, thank you
Yeah.
guys. And you've been listening to Voided Transmissions.